Everyone hear me okay? Sounds kind of muffled up here, so just... Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vince, and I'm super excited today to geek out with you about data. And before you leave, don't leave, it's not a trap. I promise this is going to be a very humanistic, very story-driven way of looking at data. And so, let me start with this. I work with King County. How many of you are familiar with King County? That's a lot of people. That's awesome. Usually it's like 3 people, including me. So you should all be familiar with King County because you're in King County right now. Seattle is in King County. And one of the weird things about county government is that the city of Seattle gets a lot of credit for a lot of the stuff that we do. So I get a little bit bitter. But no one from Seattle is here, I don't think. So we're gonna drag them. We're gonna drag the city. Okay, so a little bit about King County so that you kind of understand sort of what organization I'm coming from and my context. We're fairly large. We have 14,000 employees across the county. We have a ton of different locations. And we have a lot of different departments that are very diverse, right? So we have things like public health, things like natural resources and parks, things like the jail is part of the county. And so our employee base is very different, right? So a King County employee is the soil scientist collecting water samples out on the lake. A King County employee is the public health nurse at the downtown clinic. The King County employee is the bus operator that actually took me to this conference this morning. That's a King County employee, right? So it's very diverse, and where I sit in the organization is trying to manage sort of how we plan enterprise-wide for an employee base that's that large. Yes, it's that King County, Martin Luther King Jr. And because that is sort of who we've chosen to shepherd and steward our county, we have very strong values of equity and social justice. And so that sort of blends, that's the lens that we sort of use in all of the work that we do. And you sort of see this, it even influences our data analytics, right? How we look at our data. And so I just wanted to point that out. It's a very important thing that is very big for the county. So you might be wondering why I'm up here. What am I about? And I love that introduction because yes, we're trying to reclaim data wonk. So a little bit about me. Anyone from Minnesota? Yeah, Minnesota State Fair. Okay. I'm the enterprise data analytics guy at King County, and what that means is that my portfolio of projects has to do with anything that spans across the different departments, enterprise-wide, that has to do with data analytics. So in my portfolio are things like customer service, things like employee engagement, and things like performance management, performance measurement. And so my favorite of those is employee engagement, of course. I've had a career full of data type jobs. I was a management consultant for a long time, and one of the things that people always told me, and that was like a compliment, was, "Oh, Vince, you're so analytical," or like, "Vince, you're so good with numbers," and I'm like, "Thank you," but the thing that I never thought. I mean, those aren't compliments because what's interesting to me is sort of so what? I'm really good at spreadsheeting, but what about people? What about the thing that you do with the data, right? And so that's really my frame of reference. My frame of mind is that I want to be, yes, okay at data, but then put that humanistic spin on it and ask what the data tells us. What are we doing with it, right? It's not enough to just be really smart at data and algorithms and all that stuff. You're just going to alienate a bunch of people. And so what I really want to champion in this new data wonk world, we're reclaiming the word, is that these are people that help make decisions with data and help make data easier to understand for everyone else. So what are we going to talk about today? First, we're going to start with why stories are important. And I love to start with this because anyone familiar with Brené Brown? Yes, you're my people. Brené Brown is this awesome psychologist from the University of Houston, and she does, she writes Daring Greatly and all that stuff, but she has a great quote about stories. And the quote goes, "Stories are just data with a soul." Right? Write that down. It's great. It's great. And so that's what I find. That's what I'm finding. Right? It's we all look at data. You don't have to call yourself a data wonk to look at data, but again, what's important is what's behind the data. So we'll talk about that, why that's so important to have that sort of reference point. I'll show you how we, King County, looks at our data. And again, we do nothing revolutionary, but I think it's some things that you can think about and take back to your organizations. And I want to leave you some tools and approaches to consider. Again, we're the county, we're government. So I'm like, you guys are probably way ahead of us, but I just want to show you what we're doing, and maybe it's something that you can do too at your organization. So let's start with why stories are important. Okay, so once upon a time, there was a business unit in King County called Performance Strategy and Budget. This is the unit that I work for. And much like my title, or much like really long things, the longer things are, they're meaningless and or non-essential. So what we are in charge of at Performance Strategy and Budget is big enterprise deliverables, like the enterprise budget, right? That's something that our office delivers. The enterprise strategic plan, that's something that we deliver. And performance management, we're in charge of that too. And so as you can imagine, we're very popular with the rest of the departments. They love us. They invite us to all their parties. No, they hate us. We're the guys that come out into your department and tell you why you're doing things wrong, right? And with that type of work, we're very analytical people. We're very spreadsheeting people. And we wanted to sort of challenge this notion of okay, what does it mean to be an analyst? And so that's sort of where the story, those are the players in the story, right? Imagine this office of 100 analysts. And many of you, we do an annual engagement survey. And this was our engagement index in 2016. So those of you that do these large surveys, you know that this is a really high number. This is a super high number for an engagement index. And the engagement index is sort of like the thermometer reading of sort of where your business unit is at. So I got up and I was presenting this to the group, and I was all excited about it. I'm like, hey, in our 14,000 employee organization, we have one of the highest engagement indices in the county. And I was all excited. And then the meeting ended, and you know how after meetings, there's all those meetings after the meetings? And so I was cleaning up, and I just happened to eavesdrop on one of the meetings, and people were saying things like, I don't believe that number, or that number doesn't tell me anything, or are we sure we have the right report? Is this number for our unit? And as an analyst, whenever I hear things like that, that's a red flag for me, because this is supposed to be, again, sort of the gut reaction thermometer read on the organization, and if it's not, if people are questioning it, then that's a big problem. When you look at your phone, it says it's 70 degrees, and you go outside, and you're like, yeah, it's about 70 degrees, right? If you go outside and it's freezing, and it's incongruent with what your reading is, that's a problem. So I wanted to dig a little deeper into what was going on behind that number, why it wasn't representative, why the story that people had and the experiences that they had at our office were not fitting our number. So I looked at a couple, I split and dived deep into the data, and I saw a couple really interesting things. So we asked a question on our survey. My manager deals with problems around coworkers effectively. And I looked at that question, and I broke it out by gender. On the left-hand side is the percentage of women that agree with that statement, and on the right-hand side is the percentage of men who agree with that statement. That's pretty big. Usually, again, you people know that plus or minus 5 on a large survey like that, that's something you want to pay attention to, and this is more than 5. This is for the question, I have the authority to do my job well. 74% women agree, but 89% of men agree, which is weird because our office is mostly women. So interestingly, we have a 70-30% mix for gender, and it's mostly women, and so that's odd. And finally, this one is, I understand how I could advance in my career at King County. Again, women on the left, men on the right. Plus or minus 40? 40. That's insane, right? This is a big problem. And so what we did, being the good analysts we were, we commissioned some extra work. And a survey is a tool that you use to collect quantitative data. You collect numbers with it. And so since the stories were so different and the lived experiences were so different, we needed to get the qualitative data, the narratives, the comments. And so we held focus groups and we did interviews to try to figure out what are the themes of like, what's it like to work at PSB? What's not jiving with your experience here? And here are some of the things that we found. PSB has a culture of silence. There's a perception of favoritism among leadership at PSB. And the culture as a whole is conflict averse. So those themes were the starkest among the gender disparity, right? So it was mostly, I mean, not to overgeneralize, but like the qualitative data we got from men were like, oh, it's fine, right? Nothing, everything is fine. But then the responses from women, again, 70% of our unit echoed these sentiments. And so you look at 89%, you look at these stories and like, does not compute, right? Like what's going on? And so this is where, Jeannie comes in the mix. Jeannie was really sad that she couldn't be here. She tripped on her fleece sweater doing laundry, which is like my literal nightmare. And I was like, I'm gonna shred all my fleece. But Jeannie is our trust, safety, and inclusion manager in our office. She's the sort of culture point of contact for culture in our office. And I talked to her about how hard it was to do this analysis with my massive 14,000 person survey. And we talked about how there's something missing, right, from our surveying if there's these themes in our unit. And so that's what we started tiny pulsing, and we started collecting other sort of feedback with other tools. And so that's the end of chapter 1, right? That's sort of what sort of caused us to think we need to do something different. And so next, I want to show you how we look at our data, because this is sort of where the really cool stuff happens. So because, again, I feel like I'm going to say this a lot, but because we're analysts, we had to design our feedback mechanism, our pulsing mechanism, a little bit differently than like an HR strategy, but we really looked at it with a program evaluation lens. So program evaluation is like this really academic thing where you basically are trying to understand if something is causing something else, right? Like, does this intervention cause this effect? And you see it a lot with like education and like drugs, like drug testing. And so we were really mindful from the beginning about even simply what questions are we asking? So we designed, we call it a question curriculum, so that we knew exactly what type of question we were asking, how we were asking it, when we were asking it, so that we could track this data for our office. And so just to kind of give you an idea, we love the Tiny Pulse question bank, but we wanted very targeted information. So we customized pretty much all of our questions. And we have several categories that we came up with as a group. So we have our own baseline, our own office baseline that we ask. That's the TSI baseline, and again, TSI is trust, safety, and inclusion. Our director, who is the CFO of King County, he has a set of leadership expectations that he wrote out. There are like 10 things that he expects of his leaders. And it was very clear through the focus groups and the interviews, the culture of silence, the favoritism, our leaders weren't upholding those values. So we wanted to build in a layer of sort of accountability for our leadership. So we like one-to-one took a leadership expectation and turned it into a question. Then we, of course, wanted to compare across other organizations. So we had the Tiny Pulse baseline, the happiness question, and then we have personal growth questions because of that 40 percentage point disparity between men and women. So this is how we're very, very mindful. We plan this like a quarter at a time, and we're very careful about sort of what questions we ask and when, and how we ask them. Live Pulse is great, but our analysts want more than that. They want to know what's in the data. They all want to be administrators, right? And so we designed custom reports to go out with all these pulses. And so just so you can get an idea, it kind of looks like what you see on the left here. There's one half of it is like the quantitative stuff, and then the other half is the qualitative stuff. Because what's really interesting is, comments and everything are all anonymous, but in order to be transparent and in order to sort of increase that feedback loop, we wanted to show people something. So what we do is we do, I'm trying not to get too wonky, but we do like a qualitative analysis on the comments. And literally what that means is we're looking at all the comments. We have different, imagine you have like all the comments that you get, you have different colored highlighters, and each time a comment mentions leadership, you highlight it green. Each time it mentions accountability, you highlight it red. And you do that for all your comments, and then at the end of the day, you count up the numbers of colors you have. And that's how you do coding analysis. That's what qualitative analysis is. And so we present the biggest coded themes for our employees so that they can see what's going on in the comments. And we also are very important, one of our priorities is to highlight the data effectively in a way that makes sense. And so we're big fans of sort of alternative data visualization styles. So this is one of my favorite graph types of all time. It's a dot plot. And it really shows you very easily how the responses break out by demographic. All right, so it was really important for us to be able to see what the story is behind the data right away. We saw that women's responses over the course of a 2-year period were consistently lower than the responses of men in every category. So it's one thing for leadership to see the report every week, right? Like, okay, this is the score this week, this is the score this week. But they were not really picking up on the trends. It's hard to pick up on the trends if you just see like a piece of paper every week. But if you had this on your desk every week, oh, again, we're adding to the trend line, women's responses are lower again, that's hard to ignore. We were trying to get leadership to do something and to see that this was a problem. So interestingly, you may see that on some of the questions where the women's scores are actually higher than men's, those are questions about how, like leadership and development. So like how, or growth and development rather, how important is that to you? So again, we're seeing that it's very important for women, but then the scores are 35% agree. So it's really interesting to sort of see that play out in this trending graph. We also saw that the scores for employees of color were consistently lower than white employees' responses in most categories. Again, it's really important to us to sort of isolate, is this a gender issue or is this a race ethnicity issue? Now, I don't want to say that like you can sort of segment those issues very black and white because intersectionality exists and it's very complicated in terms of identity, but we wanted to make sure that we were targeting our interventions in the right way. So for some of these questions, there's a big disparity between white employees and employees of color, but not for gender, right? So we wanted to see in cases where that happens so that we can understand the dynamics at play. We went really deep on a lot of questions. And so here's one that I want to point out. It's one of our custom questions, and it says, in the last month, PSB leadership has avoided using language that is at someone else's expense. Because believe it or not, our leadership was talking trash about like each other and other employees behind their backs. And so in 2017, that score, the aggregate score was a 6. We had a lot of interventions. We had coaching. They all got coaching. We had all this training. And then in 2018, it rose to 6.9, which you all know is a really big movement, right? It's like, that's great. It's like a full point. So then I have to be sort of the pain in the ass and be like, well, hold on. Like, let's look at that closer. When you disaggregate it by gender, it's a very different story. So in 2016, both men and women both equally kind of rated as a 6. In 2018, where you had that point increase, the women's scores were actually slightly lower than they were last year. The men's score was way higher. So in this case, when our scores increased from 6 to 6.9, 100% of that increase was because of the male experience in our office. Nothing had gotten better for women in our office. Again, 70% of our office is women, right? So this is something that we're first we want to celebrate, but then we're like, wait a minute. Let's look deeper at this and see what's going on. And again, wanting to target the intervention in the right way. And so we do this sort of analysis on all of our questions, and we go really deep. We look at like tenure and age. Tenure and age are two things that I think are conflated a lot. So one thing for you to consider is making sure that you understand if things are by tenure or if things are by age. We wanted to do a lot of myth busting too in our organization, and so our leadership, when we started Tiny Pulsing, they were like, well, that's nice, but you guys are so shielded from all that. You're just analysts, it's fine. Like you guys, we're pretty robotic, some of us. And so we wanted to challenge that and see. So this is our industry happiness trend. This is the public sector happiness trend in Tiny Pulse. So interestingly, for all you Tiny Pulse people, I would be super fascinated to see what the patterns are on election years and non-election years. That's fascinating, right? Does it change? Like, does that? Anyway, just something for you guys to think about. And then give me that data. So this is our industry trend. This is our trend as a group of analysts, again, right? We're like Excel buddies. And we can pinpoint exactly what happened to cause those dips. So the first dip there, we can pinpoint exactly why that happened. The next dip, we can pinpoint why that happened. And so we want to isolate these things and say, this is the impact of poor communication on your part. When, on the day that dropped, this happened, and this is how you handled it. And everyone was yelling about it, and it did impact us. Right? Myth busting, all this stuff goes up onto our leadership's, they have like we call it a tier board. They have a performance dashboard, and they see it every day. And it's, again, like that disparity line graph, it's really hard to ignore when you kind of have it in your face. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about tools and approaches for you all to consider in your organizations. The first one being be unapologetically detailed with your variables. So before I kind of go deeper on this, how many of you are HR people? Okay, I love you. You know how like they say that HR is a family? I'm like step cousin to HR with like data analytics. But working with HR, my experience has always been like, they give you the data that you need to know. Like you only get the data that you need to know. And as a data analyst, like I don't know what I don't know. Like I don't know what the relationships are. I don't know if there's a thing around tenure and happiness or around age and happiness, but I won't know until you give me the data. And so I had to really fight to make sure that I had the data that I needed, which was everything that I could. Give me everything, throw in all the variables. So when you're looking at doing analyses, if you think, start with the easy ones like gender and race, but then ask for more. What about like the number of times someone's gone to training? Just ask for any variable you can because you never know what's going to click in the model that you create. Second one, get creative with your graphs. Now, I love Excel. Oh, like Excel. Like, I love Excel, but like my piece of advice to you is do not trust her, okay? Like, it's like Siri. Like, we love Siri, we love Cortana. Do not trust them because the default Excel graph, I mean, do you know what goes into that? Like, no one knows what the algorithm is that like makes sure that like the wedges are like in the order they are and things like that. Like, you just don't know, right? And so it can tell you it can give you a bad answer. It's really good for just exploratory analysis, but if you're going to present something, there are better ways to communicate than like the default Excel graphs. So two graphs that I really like, slope graph, dot plot. You can Google sort of how to make these. You can do these in Excel. You can Google how to do it, or send me an email. I have templates where like all you have to do is put in numbers, and then it creates the graph. I'm happy to share those. We slaved over those. Happy to share them with you. Get creative with them because know that leadership loves seeing like graphs and shapes and colors and stuff like that. So like things like this are really good for them. The third one is build good survey questions. And again, love Tiny Pulse's question bank, so no hate there. But I'm a researcher, and so we can be sticklers about how you ask things, what's the verbiage you're using, and things like that. So I want to kind of leave you with a couple tips. I didn't want to overwhelm you with like the catalog of how to write a good survey question. There are entire college courses on that. But a couple things. One, look at the barreling of your questions. So barreling is just a fancy way of saying, are your questions asking more than one thing? So you hear this a lot, like your questions are double-barreled, which means that they're asking multiple things. So for instance, my manager gives me fair and consistent feedback. Rate that statement. Well, am I rating fair or am I rating consistent? right? And that's something that happens a lot. Like even researchers make that mistake. And if you're making decisions off of that data, how do you know if it's fair or if it's consistent or if employees are just confused? So be really careful about making sure that in your questions, you're asking one thing, just one thing. The other thing is making sure that you're avoiding leading questions. So one of my business units that uses TinyPulse had a question that I loved. That it was like, rate the level of agreement you have with this statement. At times, my workload is so crushing that I feel physical pain. Like, great, very detailed. Let's tone it down a little bit. That's a leading question, right? That when you use words that are emotional in that nature, you cause people to think in that emotive state. So I can influence responses just by the way that I word the questions, right? By being leading or not. And you don't have to be even as egregious as that question. You can be leading in subtle ways too. So make sure that the questions are neutral and use neutral language. Even though it sounds sexier to use things like debilitating pain. Please, please, please use a Likert scale, Likert scale. So fun fact for you, if you want to be really smug at your next dinner party. So the psychologist that invented the Likert scale, that's a 5-point scale. Strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree, 5 points. His name was Rensis Likert, and he pronounced it Likert. So everyone says Likert scale, but now you know, actually, it's Likert. So fun fact for your next dinner party, I'm a really good dinner party guest. So yeah, design good survey questions, and at the end of the day, also make sure they're actionable. So we heard some of this too, if you all caught the engagement framework discussion earlier this morning. It's really interesting to have questions like, if your manager was a superhero, who would they be? That's interesting. I want to know what my staff think of me, but what do we do with that, right? If working at PSB was a song, what song would it be? Like, that was a real question that one of our units wanted to ask. So make sure they're actionable. Those are my tips. But I couldn't resist just having one more tip, a secret tip. Hello, is leadership there? Does leadership care that you're doing all this work, right? Really is what it comes down to. Our leadership, again, was very interested in getting the data and this is interesting, great. And would put it away and go on to the next thing. Oh, this is interesting, great. And I'm like, every time you do that, you are eroding employee trust. Because we shouldn't be asking these questions unless we're going to have action, right? And it's not 100% up to leadership, but if we're all going to do something about it, that's why we're asking these questions. So our leadership was like, well, yeah, okay, that's fine. We only want to see the responses once a month, though, because we're too busy. And at this point, we were pulsing every week. So now it's like, okay, well, we're going to pulse every month then, because the cadence that we're pulsing, that we're asking for feedback, should match the level of effort we want to put into acting on that feedback, right? So that's a good test for you if you're trying to figure out if leadership, how much leadership cares or wants this data. Then you should only pulse as much as they're going to look at it. If they're not going to look at it, maybe you shouldn't pulse. So I just wanted to leave that secret one. My boss isn't here, so I threw in a lot of things at you in sort of these last couple of minutes. But like I said, send me an email. I love to help, right? And my thing is you can Google it. All these things. None of this is revolutionary. But we put everything in templates already. So take our work and just use it. And that includes sort of how to create good survey questions, how to create those cool graphs that we saw. So yeah, and what I want to leave you with is, I think government gets a bad rap a lot for being slow and sluggish, and those are all true, and unresponsive and lazy, and that's all true, and wasteful. That's all true. But we're also doing really cool stuff. We think a lot about now the trend is employees are choosing employees are choosing employers for purpose. Our employees, that's all really they have. right? They're there for a purpose. We have that captive audience of purpose-driven professionals. And so we're trying to do really good work. And so I just challenge you, the next time you see anything about cities or counties, the work is really hard, and we're cool people too. So, and the other thing too, as you know, again, cousins, you are my cousins in this HR family. Don't be afraid of your data analysts, your data people. We can help each other. We're the same family. So, thank you.